at a certain point, you said that even though epiphenomenal qualia is essential to the zombie argument, you didn't think it was essential to the property dualist argument as a whole. And I'm wondering why you think that.
Sorry, I didn't think it's essential. It shouldn't be essential.
The consciousness property dualism, the idea that the properties consciousness has are different from the properties.
Yeah, it's a bit of a it doesn't follow from the idea of property dualism that these properties are epiphenomenal. That's all I meant. Because you could have an interactionist dualist framework, which would be interactionist between the properties rather than substances. That's all. It's just, as a matter of fact, in order to dispute functionalism, they have to assume property dualism. They have to assume epiphenomenalism. Yeah. Thanks for that point.
So I can't remember who was the next on the list I pointed out, but please just remember where you came. Elmar, maybe.
Thank you. So I want to ask a very sort of broad question because this is really interesting. The conclusion seems to be something, one of the conclusions at least, that we shouldn't construct metaphysics of mind on the basis of skeptical scenarios. Yeah. Like that's one of the big picture messages. And I wonder if you would be amenable to a suggestion about how to put that a little bit differently. Because it sort of seems like in the background we are making assumptions about belief or knowledge being on and off things. So you're right, I think. If your argument is right, it seems to follow, we shouldn't use these skeptical scenarios and on the basis of those scenarios build metaphysical theories of the mind. But, in actuality, that's not how things work. We might still do another thing. We might have 1% credence in the skeptical scenario, thereby having 1% credence maybe in dualism. You might believe that dualism is possibly true, but just have a very low probability on that possibility. So it's similar to Switchgable. So he has this view where you should be a 1% skeptic. And you should then take seriously skeptical scenarios which are believable. Like those are the more interesting ones. So he agrees with you. But the conclusion isn't this broad strokes one where, you can't thereby build metaphysics on the assumption of zombies or skepticism or something. It just means that whatever you say, it's going to take into account 1% credence in that possibility. What practical effects exactly that has, I don't exactly know, but that seems to be more less radical and more practical. Does that make sense to you?
I'm not sure. I mean, I have a bit of a problem because I don't believe in credences. I mean, I think that's all made up, that stuff. But supposing I did, I mean, it's fine talking about credences.
I think I can put the point without.
I know. So, but if it is a 1% credence, then it's something that makes absolutely almost no difference. There may be some scenarios where you could imagine that it would make a difference to how you behaved, but it's very hard to imagine what they might be. But I don't want to go that way. I understand the view, but I don't want to go that way because I think that what we're dealing with here is something where it's not as if skepticism about other minds or the external world is kind of one hypothesis among others. It's just one that you attach a very low subjective probability to. It's something else. There's something else going on with the skeptical hypothesis. This is not something anyone's ever going to believe in any circumstance. No one will ever believe in any circumstance that other people are not conscious. You would never, nothing could make you believe that anyone in this room was actually just a zombie. Serious, if we take it seriously. So whatever skepticism is, it's not a real existing possibility, just as it's not a real existing possibility that there's no external world. It's something else. It's a dialectical tool to challenge something, our conception of knowledge or justification, or where our knowledge runs out or something like this. So I'm against Eric Schwitzgebel's idea that it should be considered as one hypothesis among others. I don't think it's anything you could really believe. That's mine. I've got to a certain age where I just, you just say these things. I'm going to say it.
I'm just curious. Does it matter?
It does. Why? Like, does it have any significance to what you're up to in other respects? Like, couldn't you be a 1% skeptic? And, all you would have to say, there is some chance that dualism is true, right?
I don't want to, for me it does matter. I don't know why, but it's a good question why it matters. I'm not sure why. Yeah. I think it does matter, and I feel, I hate to say this, but I feel there's some sort of inner Wittgensteinian here where I want to say that this is there's some sort of, what we're dealing here with is confusion rather than false belief. Not confusion, but untangling, what does Wittgenstein say, untying our knotted understanding or something like that. That's what, yeah.
Richard, were you next?
Yeah, thanks Tim very much. I really enjoyed that. This is very much a request for clarification, as far as I know. And so you said that. So I understood at one point that you said that you take these skeptical hypotheses as being at least coherent. Did I misremember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And one thing you said is like, okay, and I was thinking, you're right. Hard cases make bad laws, so, and there's a sense in which it seems like very impractical to sort of, as you said, start your theory or your metaphysics in mind based on these like strange cases. But my analogy would say physics, right? You're very interested in what the possibilities are of a system, right? And so basically this request for clarification is, are you just essentially denying, given on the one hand these hypotheses are coherent, and you want to say conceivable, you're just denying that conceivability entails metaphysical possibility. Because, I don't know if you are, but like that's when I think about it, you do care about these fringe cases, they delimit the system, another way you could say is that it's a logical possibility. And so I want to know, what does that tell me about reality, So I'm still not settled on my views about the relationship between logical possibility and metaphysical possibility. But yeah, so as I say, it's a request for clarification.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, it's related to Alma's question. A very good question because, of course, there's always the bit at the end of your talk, which is the bit when you say, and this is how I solve this problem, and that's the bit which, somehow has to be postponed to the next paper. But this is what I had in mind when talking about. So I want to step back from the framework that people like David Chalmers have constructed, where there's a rather kind of I wouldn't say realist, but there's a sort of there's a very objective sort of sense of possibilities, laid out, and you divide the possibilities. And there's a whole, semantic framework here of propositions as dividing possibilities and things like this, which is a good model for certain things, not so good for other things. Logical possibility is one concept. Yeah, it is logic. These things are logically possible because I think a logical possibility is a possibility that is permitted by logic. So anything which is not an explicit contradiction, if you have a logic that doesn't allow contradictions, then that's a logical possibility. That's fine. But people are really interested in those possibilities which are some metaphysical possibilities. And there I think that's the idea which I think needs a bit more understanding. Because it seems to me that when physics, if they talk about the possible states of a system in physics, or the possible trajectories of particles, or they're talking about things that really could be, could happen. And yet, and I don't think that, so this comes back to what I just said, I don't think that the idea that we could be brains in vats is something that really could be. For the reasons that when you start thinking realistically about what there could be, consistently with how the world actually is and how the laws of nature are, then it just couldn't work like that. But for the Matrix movie, they don't have to explain how it works. Right? They're just telling a story, and that's what we're doing with the brain in the vat thing. We're just telling a story. So I'm perfectly happy to say that's a possibility. That's a sense of possibility. So maybe I'm equivocating here on possibility. I don't want to say it all comes down to that conceivability doesn't imply possibility, because I think there's a sense in which zombies aren't conceivable, right? I think there's a sense in which they aren't possible, therefore, but there's also a sense in which they are conceivable and they are possible. It depends how much stuff you're putting into the conceiving. So the difficult part of what I want to say, the thing I have to defend, is how to sort of break apart the standard way of thinking of possibility and conceivability to allow that zombies are conceivable as a skeptical hypothesis, but not as a real possibility.
Yep. And then in the back.
Thank you. Just a bit of a different direction, but I just had a question on your starting point. So why did you start with the zombie stuff versus, for instance, the knowledge argument? As it came in later, and you said, was this strictly just because this is the way the debate has gone, or is there something more substantive there? Because you might think, you framed it in terms of reviving Qualia, but I mean, as you pointed out, the Qualia stuff came first. There's plenty of ways to run the knowledge argument without appealing to Qualia. You might think the knowledge argument gives you a little bit more independent grip on this. It doesn't maybe beg the question as much as Chalmers does. So I was kind of wondering why you started there versus there.
Thank you. Yeah, really, because it's a whole different subject, and I think the knowledge argument. My view of the knowledge argument is that it's an argument. I've read a paper called "The Knowledge Argument is an Argument about Knowledge." It's an argument about knowledge. Right? It doesn't refute physicalism. It refutes the view that all facts are physical facts, which should be understood as a view that all propositional knowledge is the sort of thing that you could learn without any experience. And that's an interesting conclusion, but it's not. But physicalism shouldn't be committed to the denial of that conclusion. Physicalism should be a view not about knowledge, but about reality. Yeah. That's the short answer. So the knowledge argument is orthogonal, but you're right. The knowledge argument doesn't presuppose Qualia. That's the other thing. Yeah. It presupposes very little.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. I had a very brief question, because I was very intrigued by your argument, the response to the skeptical argument. And I guess it kind of follows us as well from the slide. It's a bit what's going on there at least. But you spoke about how this kind of transcendental response, I'd say, this abstracting away perhaps in the skeptical argument doesn't really work, doesn't really come true in the same sense. And I was wondering, there are obviously lots of arguments, not necessarily mind-related as well, that we make, where we do abstract away from certain details, but it could still be metaphysically possible. Let's say, one example would be carpets. You go into a kind of transporter, and you try to imagine, or you try to intuit, whether you would care about the person coming out on the other side, and you do all these scenarios. So what would that say about those kind of scenarios? I was kind of thinking or about thought experiments more generally, where you do this kind of abstracting away from things that seem to be somewhat tied to, let's say, these transcendental conditions.
Yeah, that's a really useful connection for me, because I think the Parfit story is it has a similar kind of sense of possible. I'm being very vague about this thing about sense of possibility. You can see that's the thing that I'm uncertain about, but it's a similar kind of use of possible cases as skepticism. What he's asking you there is, if you walk into the machine and then you stay here and your twin is on Alpha Centauri, your duplicator, would you? Sorry, you walk into the machine, you're reproduced on Alpha Centauri. Would you choose that over death? And most people say yes. Most people are not indifferent to that choice. Right? And that is a very interesting fact about what we care about, as Parfit says, what matters to us. If someone came along and said those machines wouldn't work, they couldn't work because of blah, 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 that would be irrelevant. Right? Just as I have a friend in Austria who's very interested in philosophy, but he's actually a surgeon, and he read Derek Parfit's paper, and he was outraged at the idea that you could cut someone's brain in half and put one half of the brain in an empty body, and you couldn't do that because the two halves of the brain are actually not the same. And he was telling me this. I said, well, that doesn't matter. So that's an immediate reaction, initial reaction to cutting your brain in half. So that's why you introduce a teletransporter. Not because it's logic, not because it's a real possibility, but because it brings out something about a certain sort of choice. So it's, yeah. So I think that example goes into the case of where you don't have to specify the details and you're trying to draw out a general thought from it.
Can I do a quick response?
Sure.
Just because I was curious in regards to the intuition, one criticism I've heard about this is that the way in which we respond doesn't actually tell, it might be interesting that we have this response, but it doesn't tell us anything about the responses. Because in such a world where these teletransporters would exist, we would have completely different kinds of responses to these things. So that way we don't really gain knowledge about how we would respond in such a situation. Only, a sort of very practical, slightly trivial kind of, that I wouldn't want to go into the teletransporter. So
but I don't think that. Yeah, I don't think that's the lesson. The lesson isn't what we would say if, because it'll never happen. It could never happen. It's rather, the lesson is, it's a much more theoretical lesson, does survival imply identity? That's the question he's trying to put pressure, trying to get you to answer in a certain way. And that's the only role of the thought experiment, is that. Which is a bit like, Einstein talked about what would things look like if you were traveling on a photon, Or if you were sitting on top of a photon, what would things like? Well, a stupid idea. Of course, you couldn't sit on top of a photon, but if you said that would be kind of missing the point, because I can't remember what point he was trying to make with this now, but so I think, of course, then there is the question of whether you can learn anything from these imaginary cases which you're not already bringing to them. There is that whole question of what's really being tested here. But I like this Parfit case because it's the sort of case where you don't have to work out the details, and that's important.
Tim?
Yeah, thanks very much. I enjoyed that greatly. Two of the obvious worries that everyone knows about physicalism is reducibility. Of course, the eliminatists don't even talk about that because there's nothing to reduce. And of course, complete determination. Now, nonetheless, we all want to buy into some idea of a certain causal nexus. And we might go beyond that, and we might want to say, well, there must be a body with a certain structure. We might take the Wittgensteinian point that the human body is the best picture of the human soul. And might we also say that there is a kind of phenomenal efficacy? So if you can counterfactually imagine a being that has hands to take things apart and put them back together, that is to say, to decompose and recompose, but it's never done it itself. It's never seen another human being take things apart or put them back together with its hands, nor is it seeing an animal, say, that has claws or fangs taking something apart, or even an ant, let us say, building an anthill. It's conceivable without those particular phenomena that it could never proceed to certain mental acts, or to what we call mind. And I'm wondering just what your take would be on that you need a certain causal nexus, you need a certain body with certain capacities, or at least you need to have seen those capacities in operation. And whether that would also square, and whether you see as credible what's called emergentism. And that, of course, the three characteristics of emergentism are novelty, unpredictability, and the causal efficacy of the emergent. Now, causality there could be in the sense of acting from reasons or acting from a moral norm, even if that's not conducive to my own well-being or that of my family. So I guess I wanted to ask you about the efficacy of the phenomenal in a certain sense, on the model of hands taking things apart and putting them back together, and what your view would be on emergentism. So a curiosity question more than anything else.
Thanks. On emergentism, I have sort of toyed with the idea of emergentism in the past because it seemed like a sort of deflationary alternative to materialism and dualism. I come to the view now that there's not really anything to it. I mean, what there is, it's true that things emerged. At one point in the history of the universe, there was no life, and life emerged. At one point there was no consciousness or mind, and consciousness emerged. I'm assuming not a creationist model of the human being, say. So over time, the organisms developed and more complex capacities emerged out of the body, and I think you need a body for those things. I don't think there's anything. I think if you're not, so anticipating what I want to say tomorrow, if you're not in the business of asking how are things fundamentally, or what is the most fundamental nature of stuff in general, and how does the mental relate to the most fundamental nature of stuff in general, if you manage to disentangle yourself from that question and don't ask questions about fundamentality or substance, which is basically what that is, then you don't need to say anything about emergence. Emergence is just a fact, right? It's just our reality that things have emerged. There are higher level capacities of organisms, and the interesting questions are, how are those higher level capacities embodied in the bodies? So I do believe in phenomenal efficacy, of course, yeah. Okay. Thanks, Tim.
Right, I mean, this might be a sort of re-expression of what you were saying, but you seem to be suggesting that denying the possibility of zombies but accepting the skeptical hypothesis might seem on the surface kind of contradictory, but I'm wondering if it really does at all, because in the skeptical hypothesis, that's very much about knowledge. Either we don't have direct knowledge of others' minds, or in a lot of the scenarios, the evidence that we have is consistent with some other, wild scenario that we can't rule out a priori. Whereas in the zombie case, you're asked to conceive, you have to sort of positively, if you like, conceive of something. So you're constructing an idea of something, and that's why maybe the details matter. So I'm wondering if there's even an appearance of a sort of contradiction there, and why the asymmetry? What do you think? What is it that's different about those scenarios that means there is this asymmetry?
I mean, it would be nice if there wasn't an appearance of contradiction at all, but I feel that there is because I want to say straightforwardly that the other mind's skeptical hypothesis is a possibility. How do we rule out that possibility? I don't want to say, that's how I would teach it to my students. Just like I'd say, how do we rule out the possibility that the world was created 5 minutes ago?
I guess my thought is one's a more of an epistemic claim about our knowledge and what that's compatible with, whereas the zombie case is more of an ontological claim about what there really is. So we have to have a positive conception of something, not merely an absence of knowledge or not good enough knowledge.
But both of them rest on a conception of what's possible. That the zombie is possible. I mean, no one says there are zombies. It's only that zombies are possible. And interestingly enough, they don't go in for descriptions of how they might be possible, how it might actually work out. So I think it's that there's a simple claim that zombies are possible. Well, and it's not a simple claim, of course, because it depends what we mean by a zombie, of course, and but there is that simple claim that I want to somehow just be able to explain why that simple claim is true in the case of other minds and false in the case of the theory of mind, and I have to get that bit right. But I'm convinced that's the right thing to say. Right? It's sort of possible in another sense.
The question?
Yeah, thanks for your stimulating paper. I share your worry about using imaginary scenarios or exceptions that would particularly infer an elaborate theory of mind over time and stuff. But I have noticed those thought experiments or intuition pumps, I think what Daniel Dennett calls them, they're really popular in analytic philosophy, which are a couple. They're not very popular in existentialism or phenomenology or the continental tradition broadly. And I don't know why they're so powerful and analytic. Philosophy, the only thing I can think of, I don't know what your thoughts are, like what's the collective psychology of a whole discipline, why they like these clever little imaginary scenarios. I can only think it's because they're still indebted to Descartes and Cartesianism and the assumptions about how consciousness is still somehow stuck inside of your brain or your head and it's closed in a box. And there's the world that's, they're still stuck in some kind of dualism. Whereas if you look at phenomenology, consciousnness, I know you're not a zombie because consciousness is not stuck in your head. It's interactive with the world. It's intersubjective. It's open. It's not closed. And I just wonder if that paper by Evan Thompson and somebody else at the I can't remember the author.
Diego Cosmelli is his name. He's a neuroscientist.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That I'd like to read that paper. I'd imagine, given Thompson's phenomenological background and Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, that he's going to try to pick apart the assumptions. I'm not bringing it back because it's not possible that I would even be just a brain. I'm so much more. I'm not just this interior monad. I'm this dynamic body in the world. And so I just wonder if that's part of what's going on in studies of consciousness in the analytic tradition. It's not really a question. I don't know what your instincts are. It's not really a question. I spent a long time on deconstructing the zombie argument. Where, like you, I just thought, what's the point of the zombie argument? It's kind of clever, I suppose, as an exception, yeah. But then can you just now say physicalism is false because it's possible? I share your worry. It just seems kind of silly.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things. Just a couple of comments because there's so much to say. I mean, one. I think the Evan Thompson point doesn't actually presuppose his inactivism, or it doesn't. Although it's very harmonious with it, but it doesn't presuppose that. But it's clearly part of where he's coming from. I think the use of thought experiments as part of a method is connected to the idea that what is connected to the sort of the microsurgical side of analytic philosophy, where you work on a particular problem or a particular concept, and you evaluate claims about that concept, or claims made using that concept, by assessing it against a certain kind of evidence. And the evidence is supposed to be the possibilities that are implicit within the use of that concept. So I suppose the classic paradigm there would be a definition of knowledge, or something like this. You know, knowledge where you look at counterexamples based on imaginary cases, and but actually the use of thought experiments to support general claims isn't unique to analytic philosophy. In fact, you know, the question of the definition of knowledge and finding counterexamples to the definition of knowledge goes right back to Plato. So I don't see that this is anything particular connected with the Cartesianism. There may be other things in analytic philosophy are Cartesian. I think a lot of the assumptions behind skeptical arguments are kind of Cartesian, and so I've got very crude views about knowledge, and I think knowledge is true belief that's acquired by a reliable method. And if that's what you think, then you don't have to worry about skepticism, because you don't have to be able to prove your method's reliable. So I've got very crude in epistemology. I could do epistemology in one lecture. No, actually, I think that's part of the story there, which you have to depart from Cartesian assumptions in order to solve those problems about knowledge. But I don't think thought experiments is essentially linked to that. And I don't think actually thought experiments are that important in analytic philosophy. Some people say they are, and they go on that there's this method of analytic philosophy of thought experiments. If you look at what people are mostly doing, they're putting forward views putting forward theories, and then they make up arguments for their theories, and often the arguments aren't very good. It doesn't really matter. Quine, for example, is a paradigm case. I mean, Quine is one of the most influential analytic philosophers. He didn't have an argument to save his life. He had an argument for nothing. He had a vision of the world, which he told you about. So I'm skeptical. I mean, I'm skeptical that there's one thing which is analytical philosophy as well, just as there isn't one thing which is phenomenology. There are many kinds of phenomenology. But anyway, this is a long conversation, but thank you for the observation.
I'm afraid we just have time for one more question. I think it's Christiana's question.
Thank you very much for your talk. So, given that this is a talk of deconstruction, I was really curious what remains of sort of the mind-body problem. So, what doesn't remain is the classical, early modern substance dualist problem, like how does the substance of the mind relate to the substance of the body. What also doesn't remain is the hard problem of consciousness. So then I wonder, is the only thing that remains sort of what Chalmers calls the easy problems of consciousness? So we're doing this Antonio Damasio stuff where we're looking at like where consciousness is located in the brain, or what are the minimal conditions that would give rise to, I don't know, awareness, or to like psychological coping, or like to like these causal mechanisms.
Thanks for that leading question. Are you going to come to the lecture tomorrow?
Yeah.
Well, that's great. So I'll tell you what the lecture tomorrow is going to say, and then you'll know what it will say. But you still have to come, even though I'm going to tell you now.
Okay.
I think there are two questions. There are two things that people call the mind-body problem. One is the place of the mental in the physical world. And that is a Cartesian problem, actually. That is definitely a Cartesian problem, because the physical world, or the material world for Descartes, is just this one substance, right? And so your question, the question people are obsessed with, physicalists and anti-physicalists are obsessed with, is how does consciousness fit into the world as conceived by physics? That's one question. That's the question we shouldn't address. That's the question that needs deconstructing. We shouldn't ask that question. I'm going to say something about that tomorrow. Then there's the mind-body problem, which is the problem about how your mind is related to your body, right? And your body isn't a substance. I mean, maybe Aristotelians can say something different, but your body isn't a substance. But there's a question about how your mental capacities, including your capacity for experience and conscious, the occurrences that arise out of your thoughts and feelings and so on, how are all those capacities embodied in the body that we have? And that's partly an empirical question, but you've got to start in the right place. So a lot of the so-called empirical theories of consciousness are actually trying to solve the first problem, which is the place of consciousness in the world as conceived by physics. And this is where you get all this gibberish, like the integrated information theory of consciousness and panpsychism, which I will say something about tomorrow. So they think that the question is, how does consciousness fit into the world as described by physics? I don't think we should go there. We don't have to go there. I'll say why tomorrow. But instead, we should ask, how are our mental capacities embodied in our living bodies? And Descartes was actually he said, I'm not lodged in my body like a pilot in a ship, but everywhere intimately connected with it, so that I feel myself to be occupying the whole body. That's what that's what he said. So he had a good phenomenological insight there, which is hard to square with the official dualism. But the official dualism is answering the first question, which I think is the question we should deconstruct. That's tomorrow's lecture. So you don't have to come after that. No, there's so much detail, and also I make fun of panpsychism, which is really enjoyable. So, yeah.
Tomorrow. Thank you for that excellent segue into tomorrow's lecture. So just tonight, let us all thank Tim Crane for such a...